So back in the saddle for part 2. Paul Hubbard.
Looking forward to it, man.
Everybody who's listening to this right now, if you have not listened to part 1 of Frederick Courtney Selous, go back. Stop right now. Go back. It should be the podcast that occurred just before this one in the line. Go listen to that one and then come here and listen to the part 2 of Courtney Selous. Part 1 was 1871 through 1881, essentially, or a little bit before 71, a little bit of his youth and his boisterous times in England at the rugby school. And now we have gone through the 10 years of him being a professional hunter, a contract elephant hunter, really. And now he, like most of us, is entering into a new career.
Yeah, well, that's it. He's still going to be. He's still a hunter until the day he dies. I think it's a state of being as much as it is a career or anything. But he becomes now a hunter for. I think, as we're talking a bit about, as a hunter for conservation, as axiomatic as that may seem.
His ethics changed, his thought processes changed, right? He stopped being what he was because he's like, man, there's not many big elephants around anymore.
That's right. Yeah, as the elephants dry up, which was a subject of many letters he wrote to his mom, complaining. It's always quite fun to see how close he was to his mom and several of his siblings, but especially how he could tell her what he was really thinking, which never comes across in many of his books, which again is normal. You don't have to share every detail of your personal life in your publications, but I really do enjoy reading how frank he was. And it's not to say he wasn't honest in his other books, but it's just those little details that help you understand his mindsets. And, he wasn't just worried about the fact that he didn't have a career anymore as an elephant hunter. What always strikes me in a lot of his writings and what he puts into his later books, especially his first one, A Hunter's Wanderings in Africa, is his bigger concern was the fact, well, there's increasing open spaces in Africa where we're losing some of the megafauna, to use the modern phrase. I'm not seeing my elephants like I used to. I'm not seeing lions like I used to. And it's because of us and, us humans going in. And what's fascinating to me is he puts, I won't say the blame, but the responsibility clearly at the feet of the incoming Europeans who have also worked with the indigenous African societies all around there and said, well, it's all of us, because we've all been making money and we need to change how we're doing things. And it's not like it happens overnight either. Selous still has to make his living. And as we chat a little bit about, he still remains a hunter, but now he's hunting for specimens for museums and for other educational institutions. And he's also earning a living by bringing people to hunt down here, which he was often neatly able to combine with his collecting trips. So, he's able to get guys to shoot some trophies for themselves, and then also get them to say, well, yeah, help pay for us to get that bird or that mammal for this institution or that institution. And, of all of the
Paul,
the institutions that he was close to.
These people that are hearing about him, they're hearing about him because of the book, right? The book that got published. You said 1,000 copies only went out, but did those 1,000 copies reach the North American shore? We assume?
Well, so here's this is his first one. This is A Hunter's Wanderings in Africa with the iconic cover with the 3 antelope there, and this is still the reprint. I still haven't found my original, but this isn't the one I have an original of. It's the other one. So they do 1,000 copies of the first edition, and then it goes through a further 3 editions. And then what's kind of amazing is since 1898, it has never been out of print. There's always an edition of this that you can buy brand new by so many different publishers around the world. A lot of them add their own little tweaks to it, a new introduction or extra photos or a biography of Selous or something like that in them. But, this book really becomes like his business card, And my favorite of all the reprints, because I own about 20 of the different reprints because of those additions of new material to try and make it I want someone to do one big one, with everything in it. But, this is my favorite one, which was done here in Zimbabwe in the 70s, which is a company that used to be Books of Rhodesia, now defunct, unfortunately, although they still run a second-hand bookshop. But the publishing arm of it dies in the early 80s for a variety of reasons. But they reprint several of Selous' books and several others of his generation. And one of the things is we... with this book, when it just makes this huge impact in the Victorian society, British society at that time, hence the multiple reprints in such a short space of time. Selous hoped to earn maybe like £300 or £400 from it to fund another expedition down to Africa, and when all is said and done in his lifetime, I think he had earned nearly 20 times that amount just from that. Those reprints of this book. And again, it was a huge risk for the original publisher, which was Richard Bentley and Son. In fact, Selous wanted so many pictures in the book, like he to show you as natural as bent, like you take a page like that, where he's got, very detailed anatomic drawings of the various buck that he's talking about in the manuscript. And because he wanted that detail, he actually had to pay for the extra plates to be done, which cost him £68, a figure which was a huge amount of money. The £68 could get you a wagon in southern Africa in those days. So, wow. he's stumping up a lot of cash to get what he wants, but he knows the value of his information. He also knows the value of communicating that. And, he's quite modest in the way he describes his writing. It's a lot better than what he calls it, which is workmanlike. I think he's a born storyteller, whether in person or in print. And that comes through, which is why I think his books have endured in print for well over a century since his death, and find a new audience every generation. And they deserve to. It's not just the stories of hunting, which, I love to read from him and many others, but also all the other nuggets and tidbits that we were talking about that he captures. And so what happens is a lot of people read that book. It goes absolutely massive in the public consciousness, say viral nowadays. And one of the things that happens is a lot of the people who read it, Africa is new on the radar for a lot of the folks at that time. There's increasing interest in Africa with the discovery of diamonds in Kimberley, and then there's discovery of gold in northern South Africa, not the Wits goldfields yet. When this book comes out, that's 1881. The Wits goldfields are 1885. Okay. But, there's increasing riches being noticed in Africa, and the wildlife is now seen as one of those. Not just minerals, but the wildlife. And so there's a lot of interest from people to get there and to either own a piece of it at home without ever stepping foot to the continent, to have that allure of the exotic, or to go to the continent for themselves and explore, to hunt, and to just be here. And so Selous' book, whether he intended it or not, I don't think he ever did. Like I said, he just wrote the book to make a bit of money. That's because he comes home having, sold up everything in his elephant hunting stuff. He sells his wagons, he sells his horses, he sells not his guns, but he sells, and he just buys up whatever he can to bring from South Africa back to England with him. He's still not married yet, by the way. So when he comes back here, he's looking for something new. And so, with this book, it suddenly just becomes this huge calling card for him that everyone, and he now realizes, hang on, I'm getting asked all these questions. I'm getting requests for specimens and trophies and all this. Geez, like I can get back into my beloved.
So is everybody contacting him whilst he is in the United Kingdom? He's not back in middle of, Matabele land, essentially, getting these correspondences brought to him. He's in a place where correspondence can get to him and people are like, oh, hey.
Yes. Yeah, He's in London. He's gone back to check on the family at Regent's Park. He's also doing a bit of a speaking tour, which was very common with books. The publishers would always insist that you go around England and Ireland and Wales and, all that sort of stuff, as Scotland. He goes onto the continent as well to do a bit of a speaking tour here and there. So, it's also after he talks, hey, how do I get there? Can you help me and all this? So, he spends a couple of years in Europe at this time. He actually does a bit of hunting. He goes to Turkey for egg collecting, because he decides he wants a nutcracker egg in his own collection. So that's what he does. And again, I identify so strongly with that, because we all travel to exotic places to take that one trophy. For me, it's always a book or a rock art or archaeological site that I will travel into the wilds of nowhere to get that one thing, So I very strongly identify with that sort of passion and fascination. And then, of course, the lure of Africa is far too strong. So Selous comes back here from I can't remember the exact date. Anyway, in 1882, he comes back here, but now he's on expeditions to collect for museums. And he's also, for the next 6 or 7 years, he's bouncing in and out of civilization, let's call it, coming back to collect people, to take them out on expeditions with him, to also come back to port to ship all of the trophies and specimens that he had collected, and get a bit more money, sell off other bits and pieces, and then back into the interior. And he spends a lot of his time on the Zimbabwean plateau, also traveling up into modern day Angola, Zambia, but not as frequently as he is all around the Zimbabwean plateau. He also goes into southern Angola. He goes into Botswana quite, fairly often. And so he's just bouncing around in between this, and still keeping in touch with his friends from the old days as well. It's not like he's a holier-than-thou convert, he's still hanging out with his mates. Interestingly, he's a teetotaler now at this stage of his life as well. He recommended the best tonic before starting a hunt was 2 cups of cold, weak tea. There's some advice for when you're coming to Africa.
Interesting.
I can tell you now, I personally drink tea all the time on safari. You don't often find me with any sugary drinks or alcohol. Mm-hmm. It's tea. Empire juice, as we jokingly call it,
So 82 through what time frame is he doing these expeditions and specimen collecting? Through 95, maybe?
Well, actually, until 1889. That year is a pivotal change in his life, because he enters the service of Cecil John Rhodes. And why he does this, is Selous, at his core, all the things I admire about him, the one thing that sticks a little bit today, even though I'm a direct result of some of this, all of this processes actually, is that he was an ardent British imperialist. He actually writes in one of his books that no person cannot help but be bettered than by contact with an Englishman. Which is,
wow.
Which is really, really arrogant and quite cocky, but also it was a sincere belief. So I'm not gonna like stand on my soapbox about this, but with the consequences of those sorts of attitudes, it does stick a little bit. But what happens is Selous did not trust the Portuguese. His encounters with them in Mozambique and in Angola at the time, especially petty officialdom, also their huge involvement with the slave trade, was anathema to him at the time. And he also felt that, like the man who was to be his employer, and then later on, I suppose you could call them comrades in arms, Cecil Rhodes, he felt that it would be better for Africa if the British colonized it, because of their innate superiority at the time.
Right.
That Victorian mentality is something else to behold, So Selous, having with all of that massive experience that he had on the Zimbabwean plateau, he is the right man in the right place at the right time for the colonization of this country. And one of the things that had happened in an effort to keep the Portuguese out of northern Zimbabwe, one of his first little dips into the colonial process completely independently was while on a hunting trip in 1889 in the Mazoe Valley. He actually bumps into one of the great heroes of Zimbabwean history, a chief called Mapondera. And Mapondera is another long, complicated character, but suffice to say, he was actually one of the few Shona chiefs who had resisted any attempts by the Ndebele to conquer him and add his people and their lands to the Ndebele kingdom. And so he was living a fully independent lifestyle in the Mazoe Valley and through what the hell's that place called? Teraringa. So it's basically, if you think of a map of Zimbabwe, everything sort of north, west of Harare, you know, this big area there, all the way through to Lomagandi on your way to Kariba, you know, that whole area was independent. It's where the Chinoi caves are as well, which Selous visits. He's the first white guy we know to go there. Some Portuguese might have seen it, but, you know, Selous goes the credit because he wrote it down.
Wow.
So... he actually gets a concession from them that no man, unless endorsed by Selous, is allowed to do any treaties, any mining, any farming, any settlement of the whites in that area unless Mapondera and Selous agree. And this becomes known as the Mapondera Teraringa concession of 1889. So this brings Selous to the attention of Rhodes for another reason, not just because he knew the area that Rhodes had his beady little eyes on to take over for the British, but now he had made an overt imperial claim on behalf of the British, but with himself at the center of it. So Rhodes is determined to get Selous on his side. And Selous did not like Rhodes or De Beers or the British South Africa Company, it must be said. He sided with the Ndebele out of sympathies and also with the Tswana, because by this time as well, Selous has married a Tswana woman and has at least 2 children with her, and who traveled with him everywhere he went.
Even though he's this British imperialist.
Yes, yeah, no,
he doesn't like Rhodes. He doesn't like this idea.
Yeah, and you know, but at the same time, with the Portuguese increasing their efforts into expanding their territory in Southern Africa, and with the publication of what's known as the rose-coloured map of 1889, where Portugal makes a paper claim to all of the territory between Angola and Mozambique. On a map.
Oh, wow.
They publish this, and this spurs on Rhodes to say, no, we've got to get, because with the Berlin Conference in 1885 to 1886, which set the rules for the colonization of Africa, one of the things, you could publish whatever paper you wanted. If you had people on the ground, that trumped any paper claims that you might say, oh, this is our sphere of influence. But there's British people living there. You as the Portuguese don't have a claim. It was called the principle of effectivity. So Rhodes is determined to exploit this, which is why he gets a concession from Lobengula called the Rudd concession, which was a mineral rights concession, not a land concession, but they twist the meaning of it to, you know, with a good lawyer, words can mean what you want them to mean, and Rhodes had all the lawyers. So Rhodes uses that to get a royal charter to form a company in 1889 called the British South Africa Company, which has a royal charter from Queen Victoria. The shareholders and board of directors of the British South Africa Company is a who's who of British royalty at that time. You know, the Prince of Wales is involved. They've got dukes and earls and barons and, you know, all the hoity-toity up there. So Rhodes has the British political power behind him, but now he needs people with experience on the ground. So he starts gathering up all these hunters and traders and explorers who had worked and traveled through Mashonaland and bringing them onto his side. And one of the big holdouts was Selous, but eventually Selous is seduced by 2 things. And the first important one from his consideration is that he be well compensated for his time. And Rhodes was a notorious cheapskate. You know, if he could get it for free, there's no way he'd pay. And if he could get it for less than what you thought, you know. So here, Selous is determined that Rhodes is going to pay him properly. But the second thing that Selous is he is worried about the Portuguese taking over territory that Selous felt by rights should belong to the British. And he actually writes this fascinating article in 1891 for the London Times, you know, where he sets forth why he got involved with Rhodes. And if I can quote here a second, is that he said, you know, that England owes the acquisition of this rich country to the wisdom, foresight, and strength of purpose of Mr. Rhodes is, I think, fully recognized in this country, i.e. Rhodesia, Zimbabwe. The knowledge that years of travel as a hunter and collector of natural history specimens had given me of the topographical features of the country enabled me to play my part in the occupation of the land. And I hope that I may yet live to see that far-off country grow and increase in prosperity. So Selous is hired, basically, it's always forgotten in this country. He's always remembered for the first job he was hired to do, which was to help guide the pioneer column from South Africa to where Harare is today. So the Pioneer Column was the group of men, there were no women allowed, which numbered 500. There were approximately 200 pioneers who were farmers, doctors, builders, those sorts of stuff. It's a very funny, amusing thing in the advert when they were advertising for people to join the Pioneer Column. It's got, wanted doctors, farmers, even priests and all this. And right at the bottom it says, lawyers need not apply. So, they had their own ideas on who was a respectable settler at the time. And then there were about 300 men who were basically an army but called the British South Africa Police. And that's the origin of our police force in Zimbabwe today. So this column is paid for and equipped by Cecil Rhodes. They were basically a military occupation force, despite all these peaceful professions dotting their ranks. And Selous is hired to guide them from their base camp in South Africa all the way through to establish 3 forts along the way. And then the third and final fort would now become the capital of this new British-held territory. So in overall command was a young man called Frank Johnson, who had hunted and explored and prospected with Selous in the 1880s, and the two did not like each other. Johnson hated Selous. And which is unusual. In all of the reading I've ever done on Selous, I can count on one hand the number of people who actually disliked him, at least publicly. And Johnson made no secret of how he thought Selous was this washed-up, has-been old fart, even though, Johnson's 21.
Interesting.
Selous in the 1880s is only in his 30s. So it's not like... It's not like he's some doddering 90-year-old, But, Johnson just sees him
probably
as this...
Probably 10 years in the African
man.
bush probably put a bunch of age on you, So...
Absolutely. But, Selous always looked younger than his years as well. But Johnson just disliked him because Selous also was a no-nonsense man who had ingratiated himself with Rhodes by always speaking the truth to him. He never told Rhodes what Rhodes wanted to hear. He would tell him what was the reality. And one of the most striking examples of this is when in the Kimberley Club, Rhodes and Johnson are plotting a military invasion of Matabeleland rather than this compromise of these people moving up, skirting around the border of Matabeleland to settle in Mashonaland. They were going to do this all-out military invasion. And Selous says to Rhodes, you're crazy. So many people are going to die. The Indabele will probably kill everyone. And then what are you going to do? And he proposes this optional idea. And Rhodes says to Selous, well, geez, do you think that's possible? And he says, I don't know which idiot's been telling you all this. And of course, it turns out it was Johnson. So, it didn't go well between them for their whole lives. But, Selous guides the column, and he was exceptional at that job because of his own knowledge of the country. He also knew where the borders of Matabeleland were, having had to wait at their border posts for so often on his hunting trips into the interior. But he was also known to many of the Indabele whom they encountered on their march north. And together with Jamison, Leander Starr Jamison, Rhodes' right-hand man, was actually able to talk to them and calm things down if there was anything. But Selous was very worried about being overrun and attacked by the Indabele. He genuinely thought they would all be killed. And he never writes about this in his books, but one of his closest companions was a guy called Skipper Host, who publishes his memoirs as a book many years later. And he talks about having tea with Selous on one part of the journey, and they hear this whole commotion and shouts and shots ring out. And he says Selous jumps up, grabs his rifle and says, come with me, they're going to have at us. And they run around there, and it's these guys chasing a rabbit through the middle of the camp. And of course, that's why there's all this noise, because they're trying to kill the rabbit. But it showed Selous' awareness of the potential danger when everyone else was a bit too casual, at the time. He was always the man who thought.
Laissez-faire, essentially. Everybody else versus him being on point.
Yes. So Selous actually stays with the British South Africa Company from 1889 until about May of 1892, give or take. There's a little bit of confusion on the exact dates here, but it's basically those 3 years. Because after he's led them north, when they're in sight of the area that they were going to build their third fort, which ends up being called Fort Salisbury, today the capital Harare, Selous actually peels off with several other company officials and heads east to the mountain range that is the Nyanga Vumba area today on the eastern side of Zimbabwe. And he helps negotiate a series of treaties with all the chiefs and leaders in that area to recognize the British rather than the Portuguese. So it's Selous, together with several others, that we have to thank that the Eastern Highlands are actually in our country and not in Mozambique. You know, our border. Yeah, our border should be 150 kilometers further inland than it is today. You know, Selous helps claim a lot of that territory by fair means, mostly, because, again, he was known to a few of the guys there because of his hunting exploits in previous years. And then he also...
Yet he still wasn't seen, from a Zimbabwean perspective, as a colonizer.
Yeah, it's an interest. He's remembered in Zimbabwe, if he's remembered at all, for the school and then the town, and then as the hunter. You know, this role of his, which is only basically 5 years of his life, is largely forgotten and underappreciated. And I think it's also because most biographies you read of him jump over this. They just say, "Oh, he led the pioneer column, hoorah," and then they jump straight to him in the War of 1896. They actually skip like this 5-year period of his life. And partly I think it's because, you know, a lot of information is hard to find unless you have access to the archives in Zimbabwe, because, again, we have a lot of his correspondence, which I have yet to even begun to go through on a systematic, thorough basis. You know, I'm only in his correspondence, I'm still in the 1870s, you know, like reading that. And because it takes time, you know, and he had handwriting like mine, so it takes the time it takes to decipher it, you know.
I can just
imagine. He was a lot more legible than I will give him that. So, you know, so Selous has that role, and then he's actually employed to help scout roads and build access routes through the country. Like, he actually helps open up several of the roads north of Harare towards the Mozambique border. He also opens up one of the main roads in the country today that takes you all the way through towards Kariba. He doesn't take it as far as Kariba, but why he's hired to do that is they realize very quickly that there's very little mineral wealth, so the interest of the company switches from gold to farming land. You know, that's where the whites, you know, the original pioneers, most of them were here. There's gold lying on the surface, you know, land of silk and money. And they soon realized that it's land of pick and shovel if you want to make a go of it, you know. And, you know, the thing is he one of the things is as well is that for that 5 years, Selous is also a very effective propagandist for Cecil Rhodes. He actually writes a lot of articles about why it's beneficial that the British South Africa Company and Rhodes in particular are having the impact and the right to do what they want to do in this part of the world. And he talks about, you know, like he's one of the guys who helps, together with several missionaries, create the overarching myth of the Ndebele as these brutal overlords of the Zimbabwean plateau, because he overemphasizes some of the severity of the raids and the attacks and all this. Like, for example, he gives the completely nonsensical figure of 100,000 Shonas being killed by the Ndebele in a decade, which is, I don't know, that's one of the few times where I've caught him out where he is very clearly... He's got an agenda and he believes it, so it rings true, but where that information comes from I don't yet know, because he does seem to believe it. He actually repeats it a couple of times, you know. And obviously he had the experience to evaluate it for himself, but it is complete. If they had killed 100, you know, at colonization, the population of the country was between 700 to 800,000 people total. So if they killed 100,000 people in a decade, there'd be bodies everywhere because there weren't enough people to bury them. You know what I mean? They would have seen that. Yeah. There were raids and brutalities and killings and stuff like that. Don't get me wrong, but to that extent. So that's one of the little, you know, things. But, you know, Selous, we will be nice to him today. We had to praise him, not to bury him, you know.
So tell me, Selous, you mentioned in part one, you know, the famous, would you say there was a more famous expedition than Teddy Roosevelt with Selous?
No.
Okay.
Not in his lifetime. One of the things that happens to Selous is with the publication of his book, he is the archetype for this. His early life in Africa is what this book is based on. This is the children's
King Solomon's Mines.
He is the archetype of Alan Quatermain. And in King Solomon's Mines and every subsequent book, because everyone always remembers this one because it's the best one with Alan Quatermain, although I prefer the book of the same name. But Rider Haggard uses Selous' life in Africa as the basis for the story of King Solomon's Mines. And when you read the whole story, it's basically Selous' 20s, his 1870s to early 1880s. That is the story of King Solomon's Mines. And when that book comes out, I think the original edition of King Solomon's Mines is 1884, 1885, thereabout. Selous' book has been out for a while. Rider Haggard had read it, and he he uses that book as a basis, because when you go through it, Rider Haggard is not plagiarizing, don't get me wrong, but the inspiration is so clear, and then it's made very clear. Haggard later on in his life would deny it, but when it's coming out, it's like, relive the adventures in Africa like Selous by reading King Solomon's Mines. That's some of the press about it and stuff like that. So that adds to Selous' reputation and luster, because King Solomon's Mines is probably the best-selling book of its decade, in the world. That's another book that has never been out of print. It's been made into all terrible movies. I've yet to watch a really fun one, although I do have a soft spot for the one with what's his name, Richard Chamberlain, I think, which was filmed in Zimbabwe, but that's because I recognize so many of the places in King Solomon's Mines in Zimbabwe. But the book itself is just a really thrilling classic colonial tale that was largely based on Selous' life. And, another, as a quick aside, another author that was also a hunter who adored Selous and used him as a prototype for many characters was Wilbur Smith. Sean Courtney in the first book, When the Lion Feeds, is named for Courtney Selous, And then when you read his series on the Ballantines, Zuga Ballantine is Frederick Courtney Selous. Even though Smith mentions Selous meeting Ballantine, it's very clear Zuga is Selous, and that series of books is the story of Selous' adopted country of Zimbabwe. That the classic four, and Wilbur Smith goes a bit on the other side, but that's another story. So
all of this is happening to increase his lore, right? Wilbur Smith obviously much later, but King Solomon's Mines happening at the same time. And so Selous' lore is getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yes, but it's this book, we go back to our Hunter's Wanderings in Africa here, that brings Selous to the attention of this very young member of the New York Congress, Theodore Roosevelt, who begins a very rich correspondence with Frederick Courtney Selous. I think Selous is... I've got to remember this correctly now. I can't remember when Teddy Roosevelt's born, but I think Selous is about 15 years older than him, give or take. Okay. So Selous' book comes out. It's an absolute smash hit in the States as well. He actually does a couple of speaking tours in the States, very brief ones, a couple of months, and then he comes back to Europe and then back to Africa after the book's out.
But Roosevelt talking tours of a couple of months.
That's the travel time. You know what I mean?
Jeez.
So the thing is when Roosevelt picks up this book, he's already himself an accomplished naturalist. There is no doubt that Teddy Roosevelt is one of the greatest hunter naturalists in the history of North America, in my opinion. And that, again, you need to find someone much cleverer than me to talk about him in that vein, because, I adore Roosevelt. Teddy, a lot wrong, but he was a man's man, much as our guy Selous here as well. Teddy was another level. And so one of the things is he's a young New York State Assembly member, okay? And Roosevelt writes to Selous, and I love this quote.
Again, where's Selous at this time receiving this correspondence? Is he in Salisbury? Is he in newly formed Fort Salisbury?
No, so Roosevelt starts writing to him in the 1880s, okay? And because the book comes out 1881, so Roosevelt's, with the earliest letter that we have between them in the Zimbabwean archives is from about 1885, 1886. So Teddy's just won his first ever election, if memory serves. I might be slightly cockeyed on the dates. It might be a couple of years later. Just forgive me. So the humor is so a lot of the correspondence, like you write to the publisher, and then the publisher would forward it to Selous wherever he was at that moment in time, you know. So, and that was very common in those days, that's how you'd actually find these people, because you don't really, you know, it's like today, you don't really give out your home address. So Roosevelt writes to Selous, and one of my favorite things in his earliest letter is he says to him, and now this is huge, because Selous has no idea who Roosevelt is. Selous never learned anything about American politics in his whole life. Even when Roosevelt becomes president, you know, it's reported that he says to him, well, I guess that's quite an important job then. You know, like Selous couldn't care less about American politics throughout his life. But one of the things is Roosevelt writes to him and he says, you have the most extraordinary power of seeing things with minute accuracy of detail, and then the equally necessary power to describe vividly and accurately what you have seen. That's Roosevelt's first known letter to Selous, and it becomes the first of genuinely hundreds of letters that these two would swap over the next couple of decades. In fact, until Selous's death, that they had this rich, and you can see so quickly, it's within a year that they don't meet for nearly 10 years after Roosevelt's first letter to Selous. But you can see they form this amazing bond through the correspondence, and also they send each other books and articles and newspaper clippings. They also confess some of their desires and dreams for both what they want to hunt, you know, like, hey man, I really want a brown bear. No, well, geez, you should see the caribou up in Alaska. You know, like they're giving each other, beefing up each other's dreams of what to hunt elsewhere in the world. But also they talk to each other a lot, a huge amount about conservation. And this really comes up from the 1890s, because Selous leaves Africa in 1897, never to return until the First World War. Okay, because of the events of 1896, which we call the Umvugela, the Matabele Rising, where after their conquest in 1893, which Selous had taken part in as a soldier, he's actually shot off his horse in one of the battles and recuperates very well and helps rescue a whole bunch of soldiers later on in that war of 1893. Selous goes back to England, gets married, brings his young wife back to Rhodesia to work on a farm with him just south of Bulawayo. And the two of them suffer extreme deprivation, financial loss, and really tough times during the War of 1896, between March and July of 1896. Even though the war lasts much longer, Selous's role in it is done by then. He himself is incredibly brave, but his concern for his new wife and the rest of his family, because he never abandons his African family. Hey? That's the other thing which makes him a man's man. He takes his Tswana wife, refuses to leave, so she actually goes and she leaves him with the kids, and he brings them to England. And Maddie, his wife, or Gladys as she's often called as well, you know, he sets the kids up, educates them, and there's still a whole bunch of descendants there today in the UK as well, which was very unusual in those times, you know. So Selous, that's where he just gets a huge, you know, Makorokoto, well done from me for that as well. So he never goes back after 1897. His wife comes back after he dies, but Selous never makes Africa his home again. England becomes the closest thing to a permanent home base for the rest of his life until the outbreak of the war. So one of the things that happens is Selous then starts to travel around a lot. You know, he's still doing museum collecting, but now he's starting to go all around Europe.
You know, he goes engagements and stuff like that too, right?
Yes, and also hunting expeditions. So what he does now is he transfers his focus into Western Europe, Southwest Asia, and into North America. Okay, so he now starts hunting there to collect specimens for museums. So he goes to he goes to Hungary, he goes to Romania, he goes to Turkey, he goes all over Europe. There, he goes into Norway, Sweden, Russia. All these sorts of places, and he writes about it. This is the other part. When you read his stuff there, I've never been to any of these places, but just like those who read his stuff on Africa, I'm there with him. That's how good a writer he is as well when you're reading about this stuff. He goes into Iraq, Iran, he goes all around the Black Sea area again. He goes into the Caucasus Mountains, this is all through the 1890s, okay? And into the early 1900s, and then he makes a trip to North America. So for hunting. Before this, he had been to do speaking engagements, and in fact, there's conflicting information about this, and I've written to them the other day to ask for some clarity. But he's actually elected a member of the Boone and Crockett Club in 1897, of which Roosevelt's a founder. Roosevelt is the founder of that amazing club of hunting gentlemen, as it were. So he is elected as a professional member, which was kind of amazing. And I stand to be corrected, which is what I've also written to ask them to check in their archives. But I think he's the first one not to have hunted in North America to be made a professional member, a full member. But I stand to be corrected on that. It's just from my reading of their stuff on the internet and Selous' own bits and pieces. It might be true. I'll wait to see.
And we assume through this entire time he's still communicating with Teddy, right?
Yes, but only they never meet, and they keep trying to make it work. So, like when he goes over in 1897, Selous has been left near a pauper by losing all of his property and cattle and all this during the War of 1896. So he's only got £400 to travel with his wife around Canada and the States. And what happens is he actually writes to Teddy and he says, right, I'm coming for a visit. And then he gets offered a paid speaking engagement to go from Toronto to Vancouver. This whole line of speaking engagements, and he says, sorry, I can't come to the States this time because I've got to take this, it's money. And Roosevelt's like, of course, man, we all need money, go for it, my mate, we'll make another plan. So Selous actually, he goes hunting and doing his speaking tour, and I've just done a couple of things here because I can't remember this all in my head, so I had to write it down. All right, but what's kind of fun is, so he goes his first port of call when he wants to go hunting. So he does his speaking thing, and then he goes into Wyoming. He then goes hunting in the Rocky Mountains, okay, in 1897 and again in 1898. He then hunts through all of eastern Canada from 1900 to 1901. He goes to Alaska in 1904. And I just have to show you, this is one of my favorite pictures of Frederick Courtney Selous. Now, this is 1904. Remember, he's born 1851. Okay, so he's 53, and this picture here, and this is him helping pull his canoe up the Yukon River, like this, by himself. This is not a posed thing. The photographer, there's his mate in the canoe behind him there, and this is him pulling this thing up with all of his kit and gear and everything, like in the Native American way at that time, pulling it all the way upstream because the current was too strong to paddle. And this is him, like, yes. So, when he's up here, he's looking for a lot of stuff. So, like, when he's going there, he's collecting specimens. So he's also very picky. He's not just shooting anything because he wants a caribou for himself. It has to be museum quality. This is also how his attitude to hunting has evolved as well. He's still going to hunt, but now what's the point of it? It's still the fun, it's the outdoors of it and all this, but now he wants specimens for the museum. So he's doing bird hunting and collecting for various specimens, mainly at this time of his life now, from 1897 for the next decade or so. Most of his stuff is for the Natural History Museum in Britain. That's 90% of his attention. He still does some stuff for like the Vienna Museum and the Berlin Museum and stuff like that. But his focus is on the Natural History Museum, partially because of his good working relationship. They also paid him better. And he was also able to draw on their scientific expertise to help inform his own interests and passions as well. So there's a lovely relationship there that they acknowledge today as well, to this day, I mean. So when he goes there, he's looking for the various types of sheep. He's looking for moose, caribou. He's also taking all the different birds, both their eggs as well as adult specimens as well. And this is the amazing thing is Selous was a self-taught taxidermist, which is what brings him into contact with the main publisher for much of the rest of his life, which was Roland Ward, one of the legends in the hunting industry. Roland Ward and Frederick Courtney Selous have the most incredible relationship. Roland Ward actually publishes Selous' next few books as well, and also equips him out with everything he needs for his collecting expeditions. And one of the, just as an aside, because it's popped in my head, is that according to Roland Ward, the man himself, is that Selous shot more record-breaking animals than anyone else in the history of his company up until the day Selous died. Nobody else, and on as many continents as well. Like Selous held not the biggest of every single thing, but all of them were in the top, like whatever he harvested for the museums and all these things were always in the top 10 of Roland Ward's records up to that time. Wow. And indeed, even if you go through the more modern Roland Ward, book of big game and all that, Selous' name still appears. And we now are 120 years since he was seriously hunting. And, some of the stuff that he had the eye for is still in the record books. Again, cool.
Amazing.
So, one of the things that I also, enjoy is Selous is also reveling. When you read his books, he actually writes 2 books about his time in North America. And it includes, the first book also includes some of his stuff in Europe and Asia and the Middle East, which is called Sport and Travel East and West. And that comes out in 1901. And that is one of my favorites of all of the books Selous writes. My absolute favorite is the first one, Hunter's Wanderings in Africa. That's just the pinnacle of his writing. But my second favorite is his book that comes out in 1907. Which is hunting trips in British North America. Having been to the States,
and that was published by Roland Ward.
I think the first edition was, yes, and then it's been through so many updates and changes and stuff like that. Boone and Crockett Club have actually just reissued it as a collector's book, so you can actually buy a facsimile reprint of that from them. Cool. At the moment, I've ordered one, and we'll see if it arrives and all that. Because I love, like I told you, I like those sorts of things. There's always something else. So the thing is,
order something like that, send it to me, and I'll bring it to Zim to make sure that it gets to you, not relying on freaking the postal service of Zimbabwe.
As we make a plan, eh?
Oh my God!
No, that's very kind, Robbie. Thank you. I'll keep that in mind, but be careful. As you can see, I like books. But no, that's very cool. Thank you so much. But so now what happens is Selous is on those trips.
At this time, going back to sort of the Teddy thing, at this time Teddy Roosevelt is the president of the United States of America.
He's been rising through the ranks. Roosevelt, if I remember, he goes from a New York assemblyman, then he becomes an assistant secretary to the Navy, then he becomes governor of New York, and
governor
then
of New York in 1898.
That's right. Yeah. So Selous, and then of course I can't remember when he goes and does the Rough Riders, and then he comes back, and then he stands as vice president with McKinley, because Roosevelt was a useful bulwark against some of the more radical elements in the party at the time.
Yeah, 25th vice president of the United States, 1901, with William McKinley.
But then when McKinley is shot and killed in Buffalo, New York, Roosevelt then becomes president in 1901. So now they correspond from 1901. It's President and Selous corresponding, and Teddy keeps telling him, listen, I only want to serve 2 terms, assuming I can win the election for a second term, and then I'm out of here. So if you want to come and visit me while I'm still someone of influence and interest and all this, you better come now. Like, he's pestering him from 1898, when he's a governor and all this sort of stuff. And Selous, they could just never make it work until 1905. And that's when he gets to host him at the White House for a couple of nights. And, Roosevelt, let me just tell you now, Roosevelt was never a man who hid his emotions. He was always upfront about what he felt, how he felt, and also, and he could not wait to communicate joy, especially. And one of my favorite quotes.
Could you imagine being a fly on the wall?
Oh, my.
Of the Oval Office, if there was an Oval Office at that time? I don't even know what the White House looked like.
Very similar
of
to today.
Selous coming in and Teddy rising, going, holy shit. This is the guy I've been communicating with for the last 15 years via, it's like a pen pal that you've never met.
Yeah. And it's his hero. That's the other thing, eh? Roosevelt, not worshipped is too strong a word for a man such as Roosevelt, but Roosevelt adored Selous, both for his hunting exploits and all the rest of it, but also for what he learnt of him as a man. You know, he was another one who spoke of Selous as being honest to a fault. You know, like, and he also found Selous to be incredibly noble in mirroring many of Roosevelt's own interests, passions, and beliefs as well. And you know, this is something that I really love, because it's something that I really hope to publish by next year. But you know, time and opportunity.
You're on an elephant treatise between then and now.
Yeah,
so.
well, that's right. You're number 3. I told you.
Yeah.
The elephant is number 3. Roosevelt and Selous is number 7.
4.
Number 7 now. I've got to finish a bloody book writing as well. But you know, I just want to tell you, this is something that I've taken a bit of stick for when I've spoken about this in public. But the evidence is there, and I'm working on it to bring it to academic quality for publication, so that it becomes accepted. But podcast here, let's just talk. You know, so one of the amazing things is the two of them exchange hundreds of letters. Okay, now a lot of the letters Roosevelt receives, of course, are in the States, and a lot of the ones he writes are here in the Zimbabwean archives. And when I've gone through all the biographies ever published of Selous, nobody's ever looked at all this correspondence as a unit. Okay, now one of the amazing things, the two of them are writing to each other. What everyone has always focused on, which I promise we'll get to before the end of this episode, is Roosevelt's safari in Africa. But for me, what is so much more impactful is the relationship that these two develop about the ideas of conservation, of the environment, of wildlife, and of our role as people in that necessity. Okay, and Roosevelt, you know, he was an incredible naturalist in his own right. You know, there's so many stories, just like Selous, of him as a young boy and how he would collect birds' eggs and reptiles, and he would climb trees to you know, find a rare lizard, and you know, all this sort of stuff. He went hunting, you know, from a very young age. He was passionate about the outdoors, and he also you know, had a deep respect for even though it didn't always show in his political career, but there was a respect there for the knowledge and beliefs of Native Americans. He also had a huge interest in seeing massive parts of America, as he puts it, being protected from prospector and driller.
Well, hold on.
Okay.
Let me, given what we talked about in part 1, and given the time period that these two guys are interacting from a writing perspective, it's not a far-fetched idea, because Selous has literally just gone through the same thing that America is going through in the late 1880s, 1890s, is a decimation of wildlife across the board from a commercial perspective. Selous just gone through 100%. That for elephants and has changed careers because of it. There has to be evidence, communications of them discussing wildlife population declines, and what would we do if we had the druthers to solve this, to put a plan in place. Are there things like that?
You have read my mind. Have you read his letters? Because I have those letters where they are talking about that. And one of the ones where it comes up organically is Roosevelt's excited that Selous is going up into eastern Canada for hunting, and he says to him, geez, like, you know, when I was up there in 10 years earlier, you know, the moose were as common as flies. And Selous writes back to him and says, my mate, we walked for 3 days and we saw 4 moose. You know, I don't know what you're talking about. And so Roosevelt is like, what? Sorry, what's been happening up there? And he starts to do his own investigations. He also gets the Boone and Crockett Club members involved in saying, what's going on here? Where are we just killing everything? Of course, him and Selous also exchanged notes on the decimation of the bison years before them as well, but they're also looking at, you know, the decline of so many bird species, because one of the things that they're also swapping with each other, because we don't in the Zimbabwean archives we've got some of them, but there's all these off prints and copies of articles Teddy's obviously getting secretaries to type out whole copies of certain things out the newspapers and all that, but and academic things. They're also sending each other books. And Selous saying, "Oh man, I want to go up into the Rocky Mountains." That was his dream in America, was to hunt in the Rockies, which he does do, as we had mentioned. And Roosevelt's telling him, "Oh my God, when we were up there, the moose population and the bears, one of my mates took a bear of this size, and he was laughed at because it was seen as small." And Selous comes back and says, "Well, geez, this is what we experienced." So they both are Roosevelt, because of his jobs now, is becoming a bit more sedentary and is not as much of an explorer as he was in his youth. So Selous been on the ground and is telling him stuff that he's then percolating through the US government, to much frustration with the Bureau of Lands, which was the main thing in charge in those days, if memory serves. American government institutions confuse me a lot of the time as to who they are, what they do over years. I've still got to learn a lot more about that. But the fascinating thing is they are both pushing each other into a conservation mindset through their shared horror and sorrow and helplessness at that time about what to do to look after these creatures, their environments, and all the rest of it. And they both, however, become such strong advocates. That's one of the purposes of TR in 1887 forming the Boone and Crockett Club, was to have these guys as what do you call them? As conservation hunters, as we would think of them in the modern world.
Hunters, conservation leaders, thought leaders in the conservation space.
Exactly. And Selous has already had these experiences in Africa, as you talk about, not just with elephant, but like with hippo, with giraffe, with ostrich even, and and so many other things. So he himself in 1900 forms the British Society for the Preservation of Fauna of the Empire, and that becomes our first conservation organization in Zimbabwe, because Selous actually personally opens a branch of it here. Okay. And this becomes this massive organization throughout the British Empire, which is made up of all, the members are all the aristocracy. There's no povo, the peasants down in this membership, but these are the people with power. And so they're the ones who start setting in place legislation to control hunting. And initially it's only targeted at the whites by Selous' insistence, the legislation and stuff, because he says a lot of the time they're the problems. We need licenses, we need bag limits, which Selous, his name is Mud, hey, from 1900 to like 1904, he is hated in much of the establishment because of advocating for bag limits, advocating for looking at trophies rather than just shooting every animal that you see, also advocating that certain areas be ring-fenced, to use a modern term, to stop any hunting there for long periods of time. He says we can't ban hunting. He says that way lies madness, because it's a human necessity, is how Selous sees it. But he also says, we have to have game laws and regulations, because there are many of us who are not capable of doing it for ourselves. And this is the same thing that's starting to happen in the States. Now Teddy Roosevelt, when he becomes vice president, that's one of his portfolios that he actually asks for. It's one of his conditions for accepting the ticket, because he did not want the vice presidency. This is what I love about Roosevelt as well. He never wanted to be a politician, but by God, he was good at it. He hated the job, but yes,
it's amazing. It would be like me and you having conversations and dreams about, like, how could we change the world? Like, how do we change this thing that we love? And without any foresight or any foreknowledge, one of us becomes the most powerful person in the world, and says, okay, I'm going to do it.
Yeah, and come for tea as well. And the thing is what's kind of amazing. And so what I'm trying to.
It's just fascinating that Selous and Teddy, different continents, same mindsets, same issues, influenced. Maybe not. I'm thinking more from a Selous perspective, influencing Teddy perspective, right? Whether it was just same thing happening at the same time, or Selous had a lot more impetus in Teddy's thought processes or things that he wanted to do, we don't know, right? But
we've got very good glimpses because of how many surviving letters there are, and because I've got Teddy's replies to Selous and Selous replies to Roosevelt. Boy, oh boy, I promise you, we will have to do another chat specifically on this whole issue. But what my argument is that, Selous and Teddy have this feedback loop with each other, and they're also connecting others with each other because they were both quite, even before Teddy's president, they are very well connected to influential people, like Selous hunting with Earl Grey and the Earl of Abercorn and stuff like this, high ups in the British Royal Society, and he's able to now start talking to them and get them involved with the Society for the Preservation of Wildlife and so on, which their journals still exist today, and you probably have read it given your own scientific background, the society that Selous founds, because the journal today is called Oryx. It's the Oryx Journal, is the original journal of the wildlife preservation, that British society. So and what's quite fun is both the Boone and Crockett Club and the Wildlife Preservation Society in the UK both become known as the Society of Penitent Butchers in the press. Because it's now the hunters
that became conservationists.
Exactly, and it's a great name. Selous loves it because he says, "Damn right." That's the, and he says, "And watch us work." So with Roosevelt, what amazes me when he becomes president, he doesn't stop his correspondence with Frederick Courtney Selous, and in fact, one of the things that's happening when, so you imagine being president of the United States, and even in that year. There's a lot going on. There's huge amount of responsibility. There's all sorts of stuff. And one of the things that Roosevelt's doing is having this correspondence with Selous about which areas of the states should be protected. Okay, he's actually looking to Selous. Now, Selous not the only one. Don't get me wrong, that Roosevelt's talking to a huge quantity of local knowledge in the states, his own officialdom, his own connections and stuff. But he's also writing to Selous, hey, you've been up there. You've been into this area, and this area. What do you think about this? What do you think about that? And Selous like, yeah, no, geez, if you could look after that. And no, because Selous also been sharing with him horror stories of Europe and about the mining industry. That's what their big worry was with the conservation of a lot of this land in the States and in Africa. Wasn't so much hunting after a time, because the population could stabilize quite quickly and come back, and all. It's the pollution and impact of mining that is a huge worry for them. So Roosevelt's writing to say, well, we've got this and I don't know, and this and that. So he's actually not asking for advice, but he's saying, I'm just sharing this. What do you say? What do you think? And Selous writing back to him. And so within his first 8 months of his first term as president now, Roosevelt declares 150 national forests, 51 federal bird reservations, 4 national game reserves, 18 national monuments, and 24 reclamation projects, adding 230 million acres under public protection from the federal government. And a huge quantity of those areas were chosen in part because of Selous' discussions with Roosevelt. So here you have this guy having this impact on American national parks
like
and
a
conservation
society somewhere. Huh?
It's amazing, isn't it? That there's this positive impact from this friendship, this unlikely friendship, when you think about it, between these two great men. And Roosevelt was a huge admirer. So when he finally gets Selous into the White House, like you talked about in 1905, when they're finally there for those precious few nights together, it's just like, wow, he puts aside everything. The whole government has to pause while Roosevelt's having tea with Selous. Selous having tea, Roosevelt's having coffee. And the stories in that, I always want to know, and I'd love to, I'm sure there must be a book somewhere in the Smithsonian archives or the National Archives in the States, where it'll tell you which room they sat in, because I could just see the two of them. Everyone's gone to bed, all the servants, the employees, everyone's in bed. Jeez. And the two of them are sitting there telling stories. And Selous had traveled with a lot of trophies.
Is Selous still a teetotaler at this point?
Pretty much, yes. But I'm sure you know what? I have a feeling for this sort of occasion, you've got to crack the nut.
Exactly. They would have cracked some.
There's no way you're not having a wee dram in the White House with a man, and that visit you think about it, like sometimes never meet your heroes is such a common adage, but for the two of them, all that time that they had together in the White House, which neither of them ever write about much except in their letters, okay, it is just the most remarkable thing. The affection for each other is increased 1,000-fold, and they just continue on. And their correspondence becomes quite erratic for the second part of for Teddy's second term, okay, because there's so much going on in the States at that time that their correspondence dwindles to only a handful of letters each year. Until 1908, late 1907 into 1908, because then Roosevelt is planning the greatest safari in the history of America, in my opinion. Africa, we've had others, but Roosevelt's safari here at that time is just earth-shatteringly important to the development of tourism, to the development of hunting as a profession, as we understand it today, to the development of American interest in the safari industry in Africa as a whole, can all be dated from this expedition. And Roosevelt, it's one of the other things that I find so charming, and I could send you some of the copies I've got of some of these letters for
Absolutely.
you to read, or we could even do an episode, another episode to do. Just, I'm not trying to make work for you or me, but is to actually talk through the logistics of this safari, because that's another whole thing that I just think is absolutely wonderful. Because Roosevelt was taking the time. Sorry?
How long was the safari?
Oh, so it's for heaven's sake, it's 5 months, I think, in total. Once he's on land, there's still a month to travel there. But when they go by mail steamer, because Roosevelt crosses to the UK, he actually spends a couple of nights at Selous house now near Woking in England. And for Roosevelt, he actually says of this visit that it was better than the White House. His Selous house was a living museum at this time, full of trophies from around the world, his massive egg collections, butterfly collection. You could just imagine, I don't think there would have been, nobody slept for those couple of nights, you know what I mean? Because there's too much to look at and talk about and walk and travel and talk, so that's another fantastic time that they have together. But the whole planning of this expedition, and what makes me laugh, is you can see the cultural differences. Like Roosevelt writes to Selous, and he says to him, what food do you think I should take with me? Because it took Roosevelt several letters to get Selous to agree to help with the entire planning of the expedition. But Selous had already taken another contract for a collecting expedition for a couple of museums in East Africa at the same time. That's why he couldn't actually go with Roosevelt. But he admits in a letter, that's the official reason given in the press and all this, but Selous actually admits in a letter to Roosevelt that he says, you'll travel with far too many people. I enjoy the bush as I know it, which is myself and my couple of guys going with me out there. And Roosevelt says, yes, I wish, but the position does not allow, my position does not allow for such privilege. So what's amazing is so the culture clash is in my favorite one so far that I've been reading is about the food, where, like Selous puts in all the classic British stuff. Like he's talking about powdered beets, and he's talking about, we need 50-gallon tins of tea, and we also recommend this type of, and you can check it, Roosevelt's one letter from Selous. He crosses out in his own hand and he puts coffee and underlines it like twice instead of tea. And then there's also the thing with the powdered beets, they just crossed off and are never replaced. And then Roosevelt says he doesn't want any alcohol on the shooting trip, just a couple of cases of champagne to celebrate important occasions. And Selous writes to him and says, believe me, you're going to want, I've spent time with you, you're going to want to make sure you've got enough booze with you. And Roosevelt then, in his hand underneath that letter, he quietly is tripling all and adding in another couple of cases of malt whiskey, and because he preferred whiskey to bourbon a lot of the time. You drink both and enjoy both, but there's that sort of stuff. So it's just the funniest thing. But Selous is just there's genuinely probably more than 60 letters between the two of them, and this is why Roosevelt's still president, planning this. Yeah. And one of the fascinating things is that Roosevelt, what do you call it? has to pay for this trip somehow. So he's actually offered a huge amount of money by a couple of the newspapers to write for them. And he actually says, no, I think Scribner's magazine, even though they offered him a lot less money, was a much more genteel place to publish such accounts and all that. And so Roosevelt was offered $100,000 by, I'm trying to remember the name of the newspaper now, to publish all of his stuff with them. And he says, no, you're like a rag, I'd rather. And can you imagine a president telling a newspaper, you're actually a rag, with the power of the media and stuff. Jeez. And then he says, no, I'll go for Scribner's because it's a much more gentlemanly publication. And then also Scribner's let him have the book contract. And, Roosevelt goes on to produce two of my favorite books, which I have in first editions and owned by a former Secretary of the Navy, which is, of course, his African Game Trails.
Nice. Either of them signed, Paul?
Not by Roosevelt, no, but this is signed by, he was a commander when he buys the books and later goes on to much more serious, Pavel, who goes on to, I think he goes on to become a deputy secretary in the Navy later on in his career. So I love the idea that one secretary of the Navy has bought another former secretary of the Navy's books and read them and loved them. And this is the two volumes, and you can always tell the first editions because the edges are always unevenly cut in the binding process. That's how you know it's a first edition, first printing, because they screw that up, which I love because it's such an iconic thing. And amazing. when you read these, Roosevelt writes as well as Selous, in my opinion, of his entire safari. In fact, in some cases, better eye for detail in certain things, but he's got the advantage of several more years of prepping for his trip, and learn. Roosevelt, unlike Selous, had some early training in the natural sciences. So, but those two books, and one of my favorite quotes in there is when he talks about Selous in volume 1, when he's talking about him and says, no greater hunter has ever lived. Which is just, to me, when you get a man like that again saying that's not praise, that's reality. You know what I mean? It's the two of them, Selous. I'll show you one of my favorite things because I have the original postcard somewhere, but I've lost it.
I'm surprised. How did you lose it?
I put it in a book to keep it flat.
Oh,
I don't know which one.
Yeah, and you're like, I'll remember this. It'll be in this book of the 80,000 books that you have.
Yeah. So anyway, but luckily I did scan it. All right. So,
okay, good.
So just for fun, again, I can send you the proper thing. But this is the postcard in color here. But this is my favorite picture of the two of them. And when you look at that, that's the two of them traveling on the steamer ship down to East Africa, where Selous is traveling with Roosevelt from the UK down to East Africa.
But they split off because he has his contractual piece.
Yes,
and
he's got his
Roosevelt
contractual
has his
stuff.
safari, yeah.
And Roosevelt has his hunting and everything involved. What I absolutely adore with this picture here in particular is that you could tell Selous, look at those faces. There's Roosevelt laughing his head off. And you look at Selous' face with that impish grin. He has just finished the conclusion of either an epic story or a fantastic joke. And either would have gotten that reaction out of the two of them. And then the picture here is a lot more of a formal setting on the deck of the ship, showing there's Kermit Roosevelt there together with Teddy. That's Selous in the center there.
Obviously
and you can
discussing some sort of part of the logistics of the trip or something like that.
Absolutely, and you could just see it. It's a hand-tinted postcard as well. That's why it's in color like that, And what I just love with that is it just shows the easy familiarity which the two of them had as well. Selous couldn't have cared less if Roosevelt was American president, even if he came on safari as American president. He really, really had this mutual respect and bond between them forswore any titles and places in life, however big and important you might have been, And the one thing I love on that trip as well is, Roosevelt writes, it's not in the books, but it's in several of his articles that he writes for Scribner's, about some of the stories that Selous tells him, which are also quite fascinating because Selous never puts them in any of his books. So, I love that we've also got this retelling of some of the legends that Selous felt were, don't worry, that's not really important. Meanwhile, Roosevelt's like, what, my mate, you did that, you shot that, you went there, what? You could see the humor there. And, I really think it'll be quite fun to do a thing on Roosevelt's Great Safari as a talk again, because as you can tell, I've been reading up a lot about it. But what's also what I absolutely adore as well is just before Roosevelt's going on his safari, okay, is he is pestering Selous like you cannot believe, and says to him, listen, I've been reading some of the letters where this is in 1906, okay, that Roosevelt's writing to him and saying, listen here, my mate, I have been reading all of your notes that you've been telling me about the differences in lechery and the potential subspecies of giraffe and the behavior of lions versus hyenas, and also the expansion and contraction of the tsetse fly belts, and also your experiences hunting in Europe. You really need to put this into a book. And Selous says to him, I'll only put it in a book if you write the foreword. And here is that book. This is the one of the finest books on Africa ever written, in my opinion. African Nature Notes and Reminiscences. This comes out 1908. I don't know where my first edition is. This is the reprint, hence the pretty cover. This is a limited edition reprint. But one of the things I love is Selous dedicates the book to Teddy Roosevelt. And just to give you an idea, he says, to Theodore Roosevelt, President of the United States, this book is respectfully dedicated, not only because it was entirely owing to his inspiration and kindly encouragement that it was written, but also because both in his private and public life, he has always won the sincere admiration and esteem of the author, which is just
amazing.
Wow. Then I cannot imagine a president I'm going to be very rude for a second here, but I cannot imagine a sitting US president since him, all right, to Roosevelt, having the time to sit, read through this entire manuscript, and then write a foreword where he engages with so many aspects of the book. Like, for example, he's saying here that Mr. Selous
it's clear that he has read it. It's clear that he has read it in the foreword. It's not just
he wrote the foreword.
It's just not like an eloquent,
endorsement. It's
endorsement of Selous.
Yeah. And, like this, I love this. One of the most interesting of Mr. Selous' chapters is that containing his notes on wild dogs, on hunting hounds, and on cheetahs. Especially noteworthy are his experiences in actually running down and overtaking both the wild dog and the cheetah, having run them to exhaustion. These experiences are literally inexplicable in our present knowledge, and it is all the more valuable to have them recorded. Like, that's in one sentence in this book, and he's drawing attention. And you go, well, wow. So that's their relationship and their many kindnesses. And Selous also offers a huge amount of encouragement to Roosevelt when African Game Trails is coming to be published, because Roosevelt had made a living writing a lot as well. It wasn't like this was his first ever book. He had written several books before this. But one of the fun things as well is, he writes the foreword. He writes most of this book while on his hunting safari. The foreword to the book is written while he's sitting in Khartoum waiting to go home. Towards the conclusion of the safari, he's already got the book ready to go to the printers. And the humor is in the book throughout, he keeps saying, oh, this is just like when Mr. Selous mentioned this about white rhino. Selous would have loved a trophy like this. So you could also see there's that conversation between them. And, I think we probably should think about winding it up. But, I don't know if you're happy with that, but what I wanted to just mention was, Selous' later life after the great the great Roosevelt expedition of 1909, 1910. Selous for the next 4 years of his life is mainly in England. He still does a couple of hunting trips all around there, and then he comes back to Africa. And in 1915, and the reason why he comes back to Africa in early 1915 is because of World War One. Selous, when war breaks out, Selous is 65. Okay, and he is determined to do his part, because he saw the war as a just one to defend against German imperialism. He had switched his antipathy from the Portuguese to the Germans in terms of having seen a little bit in Tanzania about the brutality of German colonial rule at that time. He was not a fan. So, and also their rapaciousness in Europe as it was growing, prior to World War One. So one of the things is the day war is declared, Selous is at home, and so he goes the next day to present himself for war service. And the recruiter at the time immediately stamps his card, which I just love this because the card was preserved for a time, is where it just says age prohibitive against employment. And Selous is so mad that he says, well, I'll find another way. So he actually, as the rest of Britain does, he does what he can in the home defences and stuff, and then he hears about the war in East Africa, and he immediately volunteers through the Home Office and says, Foreign Office, and says, I'm going off to Africa. And the British are desperate because in East Africa they are facing one of the greatest generals ever to have lived, and one of my top 10 personal heroes in history, which is Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, who to me is one of the greatest people ever to have walked on this planet. And I know that's very high praise. Selous in the top 10 as well, just for, and von Lettow-Vorbeck is a general without compare. In his entire military career, he never lost a battle, ever. So he just dismantles the British forces in East Africa, and so they're desperate to have people with experience on the ground, and so Selous is naturally incorporated. And what they do is the Foreign Office, the War Office as it becomes known, mobilizes every old Africa hand from East Africa who had any type of experience there, and they form this unit called the Legion of Frontiersmen, of which Selous is the captain. And the nickname for them was the Old and the Bold. And these guys, there's Americans in there, there's Canadians, there's British, there's Zimbabweans, Zambians, there's all people from all over the British Empire and ex-empire into this unit, and none of them are soldiers. Selous was one of the most experienced militarily speaking because of his previous battles in Zimbabwe and all that. But there was a lighthouse keeper, there was a circus performer, there was a professional photographer. These guys are going to go and fight one of the greatest generals in human history. And yet off they go. And they are just, this motley assortment was just incredible. And they take part together with, just like the Germans, they use black Askaris to fight with them, to whom a lot of the credit in the fighting must actually go. The whites are mainly the officers and the revs, as some people would call them today. But Selous puts himself on the front line all the time, scouting, fighting, and leading his men who grew to love him. When you read, especially this book here, this is the first ever biography of Frederick Courtney Selous, and it comes out. This is a reprint as well. This comes out a year after Selous' death. Okay, this is written by J.G. Miller.
And do we know exactly where he died?
Obviously,
we probably do.
I'll get to that in a second. But the most incredible thing is Selous in 1916 wins the DSO, the Distinguished Service Order for bravery in how he had led his men against several German attacks, and the war in East Africa after that had degenerated into trench warfare. Okay, we're in certain areas of Tanzania, northern Zambia, and in Kenya, the war, like in Europe, had stalemated into this trench-like warfare. Although von Lettow-Vorbeck in East Africa from 1917 was to shake it up into a more modern guerrilla fighting, but that's another story. So Selous is by early January 1917. Selous and his men are actually entrenched at the village of Beho Beho in East Africa, which is Tanzania, the trenches have been dug, and there's been heavy firing between the two sides at that time. And so on the 4th of January, Selous actually takes his men along the ridgeline in that area, trying to circumvent one of the trenches. And he could not see the Germans who were lying down in the scattered grass among all the trees as they were approaching the German lines. And so Selous lifts his head up to get a better look. And the first bullet actually hits the binoculars out of his hand, and his head is flung sideways, and the second bullet takes him through the head, and he falls down, and having been killed. And what's so amazing is his men go berserk. They lose it, and they charge the German lines under incredible heavy fire of machine guns and rifles and mortars and every other thing you can imagine at that time. And they go berserk with the loss of their leader. And after they attack the German trenches, they repulse, they attack again. All fighting comes to an end for that day. And the Germans actually asked to come and pay their respects for having killed so noble a man. And so,
you're getting emotional about it.
It's hard not to. It's hard to express how you can feel something like that for someone not related to you and so far in the past. But you feel it in a way, because this was a life ended far too early, but exactly as he might have wished. As horrific as it was.
Is that place still there today?
Yes. It is on number 1 on my bucket list, is to go to this place. So. It's quite easy to find on the map, because where he is buried is a national park named after him, which is the Selous Game Reserve. I believe they've just changed its name quite recently to the Nyerere. I think it's Nyerere Selous Game Reserve is the new designation for it. But he's buried not far from when he died, and he's buried with the other 6 Fusiliers who were killed in action there at the time. But today only Selous' grave is left there in the middle of the park. Wow. Because it was his wish. They wanted to take his body back to Britain, and the men and also his own family objected to that, saying that where he should lie is beneath the elephant's feet. Which of course is true today. And the Selous Game Reserve is of course a World Heritage Site now, with massive protections around it. And his grave today is just marked. It's a simple stone with a flat bronze plaque with his name and his date of birth and date of death. Wow. And all the rest. It's on photos. I've never been there. It's because you can still see a huge amount of the trenches from photographs, and speaking to people who've been there, and inspired me to want to visit there personally. It's the most incredible thing, and I cannot wait to get there again. It's when life calms down a bit. That's my first major trip. And,
Paul, go ahead.
No. I was just going to say, I'd written something here to sum him up, and then I want to let Teddy Roosevelt have the last word on Selous, if you don't mind.
Sum it up.
Because I sent you a page yesterday that I want to quote from.
Yeah, go ahead.
But in my own words to start off with, is that Selous today, he's remembered as in tales of war, exploration, and big game hunting, and he's remembered as one of the balanced blends of a gentleman, an officer, but he was also an epic wild man. I think that's something overlooked a lot of the time with Selous, is that man, the bush, wherever it was in his heart and his soul. And that is a treasure. I know many people like that, and it's just the most remarkable thing. And something that I always think is unfair today, if you do just a simple internet search, is he's always labeled as a killer of game. Which is completely unfair and wrong. He was a hunter, he was a conservationist, he was a soldier, he was a husband, he was a father, and he made a huge contribution to the sum of human knowledge, in my opinion. And part of that sum of knowledge involved the gathering and killing of animals of all kinds, which is a necessary part of such a procedure, so that we can understand them in order to better look after them. And not to say that he never took pleasure in it, and the thrill of the chase was very much embedded in him, but he exemplified many of the ethics and behaviors that we see as absolutely necessary today. And what sets him apart as well, in my opinion, as a broad summary of his life, is also that, like I said, barely a handful of people I'm aware of ever disliked him, at least publicly and actively. And on top of that, everyone who came into contact with him had something positive to say about how he treated them. He had respect for everyone, no matter your station in life, from the meanest tracker and wagon drivers all the way through to presidents, queens, and kings. he treated them all with the same amount of respect and deference and appreciation, and took something away, and I'm sure left them something quite incredible. And most significantly, I guess, for us in the modern world today, was his ability to leave the most mesmerizing tales in print. You know, it's one of the reasons why he has such a legacy. He was a great writer, a great storyteller, and a great man. And
imagine he wasn't a writer.
Yeah, I don't know what we'd be talking about today.
Selous would not be Selous today.
Yeah. And, you know, you think of all the other things, people that he inspired, people whose contributions have rippled on. I know so many professional hunters and guides in Zimbabwe who have made that their life, their career, because of reading Selous' writings. You know, you know, one of the greatest among them is Dean Kendall, who's one of the best hunters I've ever met in my life. You know, and he knows more about Selous than I do, because of how much of an effect his life and writings had on him. Dean is, you know, one of the greatest ever in this country, in my opinion. And, you know, the one thing I love is I've sort of got it memorized. So those who might check, don't hold me completely accountable. But the last line of his first book, okay, which is, you know, he says, my work is now over, and should my pages have afforded any amusement or instruction to any roving spirit whose inclinations bind him to bend his steps towards the splendid hunting grounds of Africa, I shall feel amply compensated.
Amazing. Absolutely amazing. Well, we'll end it on that note, Paul.
I've got to let Teddy have the last word. We've got to let Teddy have the last word.
Come on, go on.
Because I've just hold on, because I've got to show you. Well, we've got to show everyone on the things here, and I did print it. So in his own writings, there's the last page of the obituary written by Teddy Roosevelt. You can see this is
Selous' obituary.
At the bottom. This is an obituary by Selous, which is later published. I can send you all this as well. It's published the same year in the magazine.
An obituary
published,
by Teddy.
Written by Teddy and published in the journal called The Outlook. And I can send you this page as well, because it's typed out. It's a lot easier to read. You know, there's this thing about handwriting. I can see why he typewrote a lot of his correspondence. But, you know, his last lines here are just, they touch me deeply. So when Roosevelt writes this, the day he gets the news of Selous' death. So it's raw, and it comes through, you know. So to quote Teddy, from now until I stop talking, he says about Selous, he led a singularly adventurous and fascinating life, with just the right alternations between the wilderness and civilization. He helped spread the borders of his people's land. He added much to the sum of human knowledge and interest. He closed his life exactly as such a life ought to be closed, by dying in battle for his country, while rendering her valiant and effective service. Who could wish for a better life or a better death, or desire to leave a more honorable heritage to his family and his nation?
Unbelievable.
What a man.
Paul Hubbard, you are a treasure, my man. You are a treasure beyond words. Your depth of knowledge is unsurpassed, my man. And I look forward to having more and more and more discussions on whoever comes next after Selous. I just love that intersection. I had no idea about the intersection between Selous and Teddy, and the possible influence of Selous on the greatest conservation achievement in North America, which is the designation of those 250 million acres of public land that makes the public land system so what it is today for me and my kids. So thank you, my friend. I can't wait to do it again.
Thank you, Robbie. Appreciate it. And you take care. If anyone wants to, just as one last thing, it's got nothing to do with me, but the best available biography of Frederick Courtney Selous, in my opinion, is this one here by Norman Etherington. Called Big Game Hunter. This is the other biographies that have been done on him are really old and difficult to find, but this one came out just a couple of years ago. In fact, 10 years ago. Sorry. Okay. But this is the best of the new ones, and of course, buy his books and read them. That's my advice. 100%. If you want to appreciate Selous like we do, please. There's so many editions, so many things available. You'll get a sense of the man that we love to chat about.
Brilliant. Thank you, Paul.
Cheers.